As I understand Genesis, it's broken up into discrete accounts. The first one ends in the first half of verse 4 of chapter 2, and then the next one goes all the way to the end of chapter 4. And so, if possible, I'll get through all 4 chapters. Just let me get this out of the way first. Tonight is going to be based on a paper that you can access if you want to. You can go to my webpage, soundinterp.wordpress.com, click on the resources tab under papers and announcements. You'll find a paper called Understanding Genesis Part 1, the creation account. And everything I'm talking about tonight should be in that paper. It's hard to not be familiar with the opening of Genesis. It's a very memorable passage, but as much as I've hung around the Bible for decades now, I had never really studied it until I studied it to write this paper. So these are new conclusions for me. But I think I actually finally understand what's going on there. So that's what I want to share with you tonight. I won't take the time to read it because I think you're familiar with. I mean, you know what passage I'm talking about, don't you? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, so on and so forth. The first day, the second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. On the seventh day, God rested. So I'm assuming you're familiar with that. That's what I want to look at. Question is, what's the purpose of this account? It's so easy, and it's kind of commonplace among Christians to think that the creation account is some kind of detailed blow-by-blow account of what God did and what the events were back in the old days when God created the heavens and the earth. So what did God do? Well, on day 1, he did this, and on day 2, he did this, and on day 3, he did this. He got it all finished in 6 days, and then he rested on the 7th day. That's the way it reads. But on the one hand, that's the way it reads. On the other hand, when you read it that way, it's almost cartoonish in the series of events that it describes. I mean, you've got light being created, and then not until the 4th day do you have the sun, moon, and stars being created. So where's this light coming from? How are we supposed to understand that? It just doesn't read like an actual historical account, a detailed blow-by-blow description of what actually transpired. Well, if not, now, of course, if it were that, if that's the nature of the account, the only way that anyone could write that account is by special revelation from God himself, where God is revealing to somebody, let me let you know what went down before the beginning. What went down? Well, there was this thing. The account is very formulaic. There was evening and there was morning, and that was the first day. There was evening, then there was morning, the second day. Evening, morning, the third day. There's a real rhythm and structure and order. Quite apparently an artificial structure. And don't take that as a negative thing. What I mean is it's an artifice of somebody. Somebody has created it. Somebody has designed it. Somebody has rationally put this together in a way that's, I don't want to say poetic, because I don't think it's poetry. It doesn't seem to follow any kind of template, but it's got features of poetry and certainly the kind of formula and rhythm of poetry. Well, that suggests that somebody had something to say, and they created a piece of literature to say what it was that they wanted to say. Now, that's what leads a lot of people who really don't take the Bible all that seriously as literally being the Word of God and really being the truth. they're inclined to look at Genesis 1 and see it as nothing but a human artifact. It's a human being who created they likely call it a myth, or, well, usually they'll call it a myth, that they've created a myth that serves some sociological purpose in the time and place and culture in which they wrote it. Well, that's not doing justice to what the Bible is, let alone, I think, what this account is. My assumption is the Bible is the authoritative word of God. It's absolutely infallible. There are no mistakes. There are no errors. And not only is that the case, but we need to interpret it in such a way that doesn't do an end run around that and allow me to say I believe it's inerrant when I'm treating it like it's not inerrant. I don't think we can do that and not take the Bible seriously. So my assumption is it's the infallible, inerrant word of God. And Genesis 1 is just as infallible and just as inerrant as the rest of it. But yet, it doesn't seem to be history. It doesn't seem to be a blow-by-blow account of exactly what happened, of what went down. So what is it? How are we just supposed to understand it? What really struck me is realizing that if it's not a blow-by-blow account of what happened, and he's simply describing what got created and how it got created, then I could have written this. I don't have to be an eyewitness. I don't have to have special revelation from God. All I need to know is have an inspired understanding of the relationship between God and created reality. I need to know who God is, what created reality is, and especially what relationship they hold to one another. What you find in the account is the most striking feature of this account is the fact that everything that comes into being because God said, let it be so, and it was so. Let there be light, and there was light. Let there be a separation between the light and the darkness, and there was a separation. Let it be this, and it was this. Let it be that, and it was that. I think that's the most striking feature of the account. And it's so different from any other mythology. I don't mean other mythology, because I don't think this is a myth. It's different from the mythology of the ancient world. Because in the mythology of the ancient world, the gods create reality, but how do they create reality? They take stuff that already exists and they shape it and fashion it and mold it and so on. They slay a dragon first and cut it in half and take one half and make the heavens and one half and make the earth, that kind of thing. So no god in a myth says, let it be this way and it's that way. Bam. Just doesn't happen. That's the most unusual, distinctive feature. So I would argue that that's the point that the author of this account is trying to make, is if we want to understand who God is and his relationship to reality, we have to understand that all God has to do to have reality come into existence is will it to be so. Now, granted, he speaks, but people make too big of a deal out of the speaking, because he's not saying abracadabra. He's not using magical incantations. It's not the power of his words. It's not the power of his speech. It's the desire of his will that is being expressed in his words. Let it be this way, and it was this way. So what we have is a radically different understanding of God from any understanding of God in the ancient world. Radically different. He's not just a God with a small g, a force, a reality shaping force out there that makes a difference, impinges on our lives and makes a difference in our lives. He's not just that. He's the being who says, this is the way it's going to be, and that's the way it is. And I ultimately argue in the paper, the only The only kind of metaphor or analogy that can do justice to that is the analogy of an author to the works of his imagination. The only thing we know that has that kind of power is your ability as an author to say, I want the reality that I'm creating to go this way, and lo and behold, it does. It can't help it. I'm totally and utterly and absolutely and definitively in control of every nanosecond, of every detail, of every item in the imaginary reality I'm creating. It is the way I want it to be. Well, that's the radical revolutionary conception of God that we have in Genesis 1. Because the fundamental message of Genesis 1 is God is the one who existed before anything existed at all, right? So his existence is not like my existence. He doesn't enter into the realm of my being or our being and cohabit this reality with us. He already exists before we even have a place to live in. There is no space, and God still exists. He creates the space for us to be in. So his kind of being and his kind of reality and his kind of existence transcends ours. So this is a view of God as a truly transcendent being, and not transcendent in the sense that he's in the upstairs when we're in the downstairs. No, he transcends the house altogether. He's the architect and builder of the house, not the dweller in the attic. That's the kind of transcendence. He's totally other than the space that we live in, the reality that we live in. So this transcendent God simply wills reality into being. It is whatever he wants it to be. Okay, so that, if I'm right, and I think I am, if I'm right, that makes this account absolutely the most important passage in the Bible. Because understanding God the way Genesis 1 tells us to understand God affects everything else in your understanding of the Bible, the biblical worldview, biblical message, biblical teaching. All your other doctrines cannot help but be impacted by having a different view of God than not only the ancients, but a different view of God than most people in Christian culture today. Because most Christians in Christian culture today don't view God as transcendent in the way Genesis 1 does. They think of him as upstairs, on the same plane of reality, just higher up on this plane of reality, but the same plane of reality. Genesis is saying, no, he's on an entirely different plane of reality. He existed when nothing else existed. He was already there. Okay. I want to go through here, take the passage and go through it verse by verse, but any questions at this point before let me before I do that. Now, so what I'm saying about this passage is that some author, I think there's a good chance it was Moses who created Genesis 1, but some author had the inspired revolutionary understanding that God was the transcendent author of all of reality. And that philosophical insight into the nature of God and his relationship to reality, he set out to embody that insight in an account of the creation. And so in order to do that, he wrote what we now know of as Genesis 1, or think of as Genesis 1. In doing so, he approached it more or less artificially. And what was the process? He simply determined, he just looked around, that there's the sun, there's the moon, there's the stars, there's plants and trees, there's animals, there's human beings, there's birds, there's fish, there's the ocean, there's the dry land. You catalog all the things you can see. Many of them are general categories, notice, not He doesn't talk about creating the zebras and the duckbill platypuses. It's just the animals. But also notice it doesn't talk about him creating the angels or microorganisms either. Why? Because God didn't create those things? No, because his purpose is not to give an exhaustive catalog of every specific creature that God created. His purpose is to represent to us the fact that God created absolutely everything. There isn't anything that exists that God didn't create. But he does so by simply taking the things that any ordinary observer could observe, the full range of anything that you could observe, and said the whole bit of it. God said, let it be, and it was. He just willed it into existence. Well, I could have written that account. You could have written that account, assuming you have that view of God. All you need to do is come up with a device where you, I don't even know what to call it, because I don't want to call it a poem. You come up with this piece of literature that you devise, that you create, that you invent, that finds a way to convey the idea that everything that exists, God created it. The 7 days are artificial. I think he could have made this with the points of the compass instead of the 7 days of the Jewish week. From the north, God said this, and it was so. From the east, God said this, and it was so. From the west, God said this, and it was so. From the south, God said this, and it was so. It would have done the trick. It would have accomplished exactly the same thing. So if we make too much of the days, we're not quite understanding what's going on and how this thing was constructed. Now, I don't think it's an accident that he chose the work week. And we'll talk about that as we go. But in terms of the overall basic fundamental primary purpose of this thing, he could have used any kind of artificial construct that he wanted to, and it would have accomplished the same thing. Okay. Questions before? Yeah.
Is there a reason that you don't want to call it a poem?
Well, it doesn't read like a poem.
Like it doesn't rhyme?
Every stanza is completely different. I mean, I have an appendix where I kind of chart the structure of each of the days. None of them are the same. Each one is crafted differently to suit the particular thing that he's talking about coming into existence. So there doesn't seem to be any template that he's following. If it's a poem, it is incredibly loose, and incredibly without any rules that he's following.
So I'm guessing then there's no like rhyming scheme in the Hebrew, or
I'm sorry?
There's no like rhyming scheme in the Hebrew or anything like that.
Well, my accent's too bad. I wouldn't be able to know that, but
it didn't seem like it. Anyway.
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, you have the, everything ends. There was evening and morning. It was the nth day. That's consistent. But that's virtually the only thing that's consistent through the whole thing.
Thanks.
Well, you're doing a good job painting pictures. It's really helpful for me. I'm sure it's helping everybody. But I'm interested in the whole plane of reality. You spoke about planes of reality. I was hoping you could take a quick punch at that idea. When you spoke of God existing, or some people viewing it as God existing on some different plane of reality, and how would you bring us down to earth? What I mean by that is,
well,
what I mean is, how would you get us to vibe, to rock with what he's saying right here, to understand what he's saying here? Like, what I mean is, so there's some plane of reality that he's saying God exists on, and it's beyond.
Well, maybe the best way. What's a novel you've read recently?
A novel recently? Homer. I'm reading the Odyssey. Well, it's not a novel. Lord of the Rings.
Okay, there you go. Tolkien can never make an appointment to have coffee with Gandalf.
No.
Why? Because they exist and inhabit entirely different planes of reality. You know, we're accustomed to saying, well, Gandalf is not real. Well, no, he's very real. He's very real as a product of the imagination of Tolkien. And he's as real as anyone else he interacts with in the story, right? But it's not as real as Tolkien is. At least not real in the same way that Tolkien is real. And because, for that reason, he can't, you know, they can't just at the end of chapter 3 go and have coffee at Starbucks together. And it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Well, that's how it is with God. We can never be with God. We never will be. And notice the Bible never says that we will be. What is my future? Now, granted, the kind of the folk religion of Christianity will tell you that we die and we go to heaven and then we're with God. But that's not what the Bible is teaching. That's just our folk religion, the doctrines and perspectives of our folk religion. Creation is going to go on. There's going to be a new age. It's not going to be subject to death and destruction and deterioration. There's going to be no sin. There's going to be no evil. It's going to be a radically new and different age, but it's still a created reality. And we will be creatures with new glorious bodies that God creates to live in that new age. So the story is unending for some of us, according to the biblical picture. The story is unending. But what never happens is that the story ends and I stop being a creature and God stops being the creator and we all hang out together. God will always be the creator and I will always be the creature.
Oh, whoa. Before I pass the mic back, that's really cool. The whole folky thing, right? Oh gosh, that's pretty cool. And I'm interested. So what do you take it to mean in the scripturally, right? When he says absent from the body, present with the Lord. And who is that actually?
Paul. Well, I think the Lord he's talking about there ultimately is Jesus.
Oh, yeah, that's easy then. I see.
We will hang out with Jesus.
Okay.
Because Jesus will be a fellow creature with us, or is a fellow creature with us.
Dude, that's crazy cool.
So he will be our king forever in the eternal kingdom of God in the created age to come.
Wow, very good.
Creation.
Thanks a lot, man.
Anything else? Okay. We'll take it at 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now some people will take 1:1 to be the first event. God created the heavens and the earth. And then it makes a comment about that in verse 2. The earth was formless and void. I'm using the New American Standard Version, by the way. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. So they argue the first event is God created the heavens and the earth. And what state was the earth in after God created it initially? Was basically a kind of a chaos. So God created chaos. And then day 1 through day 6 is God bringing order to the chaos. That's the way many, many people will read this thing. I don't think that's right. I think the first one is an introductory summary statement of what the account is about. He's summing up the theme and the topic of the account that is going to begin with 1:2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's what I'm going to tell you about, is the creation of the heavens and the earth at the very beginning of everything. So it's just a summary statement. So now he starts with a kind of preface or prelude. At the beginning, what do we find is the situation? The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. The reason this is so confusing to people is because they think that when the claim is made the earth was formless and void, there has to be an earth in order for the earth to be formless and void, right? I mean, it sort of stands to reason, but that ain't so. Imagine I'm standing in my dining room looking across the street from my house, and I say to my dinner guest, that house was a filbert orchard when we first moved in here. I'm not making a claim about the state of the house, right? I'm saying where that house now stands, when we first moved in, that was a filbert orchard and not a house. Okay. I think that's exactly the way the author's using his language here. The earth was formless and void. Where we now have an earth, at the beginning, there was, and I will take formless and void basically to mean there was blank, sterile nothingness. Blank, sterile nothingness. Now, by blank, sterile nothingness, as opposed to fertile or pregnant nothingness, not only is there nothing there, but there isn't even the possibility of there being anything there. It's sterile. I mean, there's two ways we talk about nothing. We talk about empty space as nothing, but empty space is space. And all you have to do to have there not be nothing is to move something into that space, to bring something that has being to occupy that space, and now it's there. That's Aristotle's concept of hule, matter, is basically empty space where there's the possibility that something could be there. If it's possible that something could be there, then there's what Aristotle calls pure potentiality. There's the potentiality for existence. I think tohu vabohu in the Hebrew here, that's translated formless and void, is this author's way of trying to describe there was the complete absence of anything and any structure, any order. There was nothing and not even the possibility for something to be there. There wasn't the order that would even allow for existence. No space, no time, no matter, absolutely no nothing. Well, okay. So where we now have an earth, once upon a time, there was complete sterile nothingness. And darkness was over the face of the deep. So it is another kind of poetic way of saying, and where we now have an ocean, there was darkness. And again, nothing. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters, where you now see the waves on the ocean moving over the surface of the waters. There was nothing except the purposing, planning, anticipating Spirit of God. God was moving. And I think it is interesting, and this is kind of pretty poetic. Instead of the movement of the surfaces of the waters, you had the movement of the creative imagination and mind of God as he anticipated what it was he was about to do. But that's all you had. You had God, but otherwise you had nothing else. No time, no space, no natural laws, nothing. Okay. So that's where we're starting from. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. So day one. So he begins the process of bringing into being that which had no being and no possibility of being until God, who can do the impossible, spoke it and willed it into existence. Let me finish all 6 days now, and I'll treat some of the issues together. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, so the atmosphere. And there was evening and there was morning a second day. So the atmosphere, there's water in the clouds above, and there's water on the earth beneath. But in doing so, God created this space that he calls the heavens here. We call it the sky or the atmosphere. Then God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a third day. Then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Then God said, let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea monsters and every creature living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas,
Thank you. Well, let me be careful. When people say things like, "Oh, well, you just can't deny that there was apes that turned into man eventually," or whatever, I look at this passage and it seems very clear to me that he talks about men and women before he talks about Adam and Eve. It's kind of weird. What do you think about that? When he talks about God made man and women, and man and women in his image he made them, and this is before the accounts of Adam and Eve.
It's before the account, but realize that this is kind of a standalone account that's not giving us a chronology. See, I don't even think these things necessarily had to come into existence in the order of the days. I think it's an arbitrary assignment of putting these things on this day, these things on this day, these things on this day. That's why it's not a problem that you've got night and day created before you have the sun and the moon created to rule over the night and the day. I mean, we know that without a sun, you have no night and day.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have the sun until day 4, how did you have day and night on day 1?
Yeah.
But that's not a problem if the account is the way that I think it is. He's just arbitrarily taking these important features of our everyday life and arbitrarily assigning them to a day, 6 days, and saying God created this, and he created this, and he created this 6 times. See what I'm saying?
I do see that. So like the Neanderthal thing.
Okay. But let's look at this in relationship to evolutionary theory for a second then. If I'm right about what's happening in Genesis 1, then the account is not telling us, when God said, let there be X, and there was X, what was the time span between God willing it to be so and it actually being realized? The account doesn't tell us. It could be 1 nanosecond. It could be 500 billion years or more. I mean, there really is nothing in the account that would give me any way of knowing one way or the other how long it took.
Yeah.
The purpose of the account is telling us the relationship between that thing and God. That is the product of his will. It is his design, it is his purpose, it is his will, it is that brought it into existence. But he's not telling us how it happened or how long it took or anything of the sort. So in that sense, Genesis 1 is completely compatible with an evolutionary theory that says it took long time.
Very good.
What it's not compatible with is a Darwinian evolutionary theory that says, how did it happen? By random occurrence, random chance, and natural selection. This is completely incompatible with that.
I see. Yeah.
Because what this is saying is there wasn't anything random about it. Everything was exactly as God purposed it.
Yeah.
The only kind of evolutionary theory that is compatible with this is an evolutionary theory that would argue that God created some kind of seed of life and that had built into it all of the mechanisms and all of the possibilities of unfolding naturally over time into the whole spectrum of biological life and stuff like that. Would that be compatible with this? Yeah. So then we just have to ask the question, but is that scientifically and philosophically plausible? At this point in time, I'm not inclined to think so, but I'm not going to object to it on the basis of Genesis 1. I would object to it on the basis that just doesn't really actually make sense given the data.
I see.
I mean, if it did unfold, you need to be able to give the story of how it unfolded. If you can give me a plausible story about how it unfolded over time, then okay, then you've given an account that makes sense. But I don't think science can do that now, not yet. Maybe they will be able to in the future, but I'm a little dubious about that.
Cool.
So, is this compatible with God bringing creatures full-grown, fully developed into existence in the flash of in the twinkling of an eye? Yeah, sure, absolutely. Could God have done that? Absolutely. We don't know. The account doesn't really help.
So day isn't really a day. It's just this artificial sort of device that the author is using to say, at this point God did this, and at this point God did that.
Yeah, it's not even intended as a
Time thing.
Time.
Right.
It's not
Yeah.
a temporal concept at all.
Yes.
It's a basket for putting categories in.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
now, why the day then? Because I haven't got there yet. There's a secondary purpose of the Genesis account. The first and primary purpose and most important purpose is to declare God to be the transcendent author of all of reality. But the second purpose is to explain the Sabbath. And in order to do that, he takes the Hebrew week that has a Sabbath day at the end of the week. The 6 days are the days you work. The seventh day is the day you stop working and don't work. So why did he pick 6 days? Because he wants to make a point about the distinction between working and not working. And as it happens in the Jewish week, there's 6 days that you work. So 6 days of creation. Those are the days that God was working to do what he was doing, to create the heavens and the earth. The seventh day, he stopped. I would argue that if he didn't have that second purpose of somehow making sense out of the Sabbath and Sabbath observance, then he could have picked anything, like I say, the points of the compass or the months of the year or whatever, anything. Okay, cool. So the Neanderthal, another important point is don't.
Okay, question. I'm assuming that the waters above the expanse, is that like the space that we think of as space that they would have seen as something along those lines, or is it something else, or do you? Oh, okay.
Because I think the expanse is simply this. Because notice they call the expanse, we call it heavens, but they use the word heavens for what we call the sky. That's where the birds live. So in scientific terms, it's what do we call this part? The lower atmosphere with it. not the stratosphere, but the atmosphere or whatever.
I don't know.
I think he's just talking about the lowest part of the atmosphere that the clouds float on, and they drop their water from above the expanse.
Okay. Also, I wanted to make a comment. I don't know. You can maybe comment on this as well. I think it's interesting that the context in which he's writing, where what the gods were from the polytheistic perspective was nature. That nature is identical with the gods, and so if you wanted to talk about what was divine, then you would say the lightning is divine because Zeus is in charge of the lightning, or the waters are divine because that's Neptune. There's a sense in which nature itself is what is divine. And this strikes me as being significantly different and making a huge distinction by saying all those things that you think of as being divine, nature itself is not divine. I don't know. And that was the context in which they were writing, and that probably would have made a big splash, I would think.
Right, and that's a great point. And everything you're saying, what I'm
Did you comment on why why is he talking about the Sabbath, and why there? I mean, what is the point he's making? Are you going to comment that in the future? It just
Well, I don't know why he does. I'm pretty sure I understand why is not the reason. It's not because he's looking back on what actually happened at the beginning of the world, and he said, back in the day when God created the world, he worked so hard, he got puckered up, and he had to have a day of rest. And because he had to have a day of rest, maybe it'd be a good idea for us to communicate. I don't think that's what he's doing. In fact, I'm going to argue it's not a day of rest at all. But that's the only thing I know for sure. It is interesting why, of all things, to turn into well, that's not true. Well, in my paper, I make a connection between the creation account is a very appropriate way to explain the Sabbath if we understand the Sabbath the way I articulate it in the paper, because well, hang in there with me. Let's get into talking about the Sabbath and what I think the Sabbath is and what its meaning and significance is, and then I can answer that a little bit better.
You're done. Cool. Here you go.
When it talks about the expanse in the midst of the waters, and then I think that's the place. Do you see that as referencing the waters in the first part where it says the Spirit of God was hovering over them? Because we don't have anywhere that he says God created these waters and then separated them. But I thought you were suggesting that the waters don't actually really exist. It's just saying.
Yeah, no, I think it's implied in let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters that the waters have to be a part of God's creation itself. See that's another interesting. I mean, look at the things that we know God created that don't even make it into this account. And the waters are only there by implication. There are other things that are there that are not there at all. But we know he created them. That's what makes me think that this is just intended to be a kind of rhetorical device to represent to us the fact that everything that is God created. He created A to Z, therefore he created everything that is. And the A to Z isn't even really everything because there's the meta alphabet and the Hubble alphabet, and those are created by God as well. Mm-hmm. But how do you represent that? Well, he created everything from A to Z.
Is there a reason for not taking? I mean, I can see the beginning as being an introductory statement, and I think that in any view it would be an introductory statement. But is there a reason for not taking it as, here's my introductory statement, God created the heavens and the earth, and so in your mind imagine heavens and earth, but we don't have any form or really detail for that yet. And so now it's talking about how God then goes to populate everything. But saying God created the heavens and the earth right from the off the bat would be saying he created everything. So is there a reason for not going that direction?
So the heavens and earth just space? I mean, the problem is the
Mm-hmm.
account explicitly tells us that here he created the heavens and here he created the earth. The account's going to include that.
I see.
He brought all the waters into one place and left the dry land.
Mm-hmm.
He separated the waters with the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
He created the expanse, the heavens,
Mm-hmm.
to be the thing that separated the waters. I mean, he's making it explicit that he's creating those very things within the account itself.
I see. Okay, that makes more sense. Thanks.
Okay. Anything else in the first 6 days before we get to the 7th? Got
We
it. Got it.
There you go. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that, everybody.
Okay. The Hebrew word that they translate rested doesn't necessarily mean rested in the way we think of rested. You don't have to be fatigued and drained and need to be restored, and in order for rested to be the concept. I would translate it, he ceased on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. He stopped. Why did he stop? Well, the account tells us, because he was done. He didn't have anything more to do. He was done. Now, in what sense is he done? That's the critical question, it seems to me. Is he done with all of his creative activity? Well, that would make absolutely no sense in the light of the rest of the Bible. You have that account where Jesus heals a lame man, I believe, one of his miracles of healing, and Jesus says, God, my Father is working, and I must work too. As he's not resting, he's working. So it makes no sense to think that after the 6 days of creation, or the account that is described in the 6 days of creation, there came a point in time where God was done with his creative activity. I would argue that God is never done with his creative activity. In fact, God is the one that Paul describes in his message to the Athenians at Mars Hill, in God in whom we live and move and have our being. See, I think the very next second of my existence is created by God. It's the creative work of God that gives us any existence at all. We're not little wind-up toys that God created during the first 6 days and wound up and then set me loose. That's not who we are. We are characters in this story that he's creating, and the very nature of who I am needs to be created in the very next moment. I have a choice to make in the next moment, and that choice is going to determine who I am, what kind of person I am, what kind of being I am. Well, who's going to create that choice? The author of my being, the one in whom I live and move and have my being. He's the one who's creating me. So God is creating multiple stories with each of us as protagonist in the story that centers in me. And in the creation of those stories, God is working to bring about the creation of the narrative that he wants to create. So it makes no sense in light of the rest of what the Bible is saying, I would argue, for him to be done creating at the end here. And notice the text doesn't say he's done creating. Let's read it again. Thus the heavens and earth were completed. What did he complete? What the account is about, the creation of the heavens and the earth. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. He created beings to inhabit the heavens and the earth. By the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he ceased on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. He didn't cease from all his work, period. He ceased from all his work which he had done. The New American Standard has then. I would not translate it that way. It makes it sound like it's sequential. I think this is an editorial comment now by the author of the account. So God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he ceased from all his work which God had created and made. So I think the point he's making, he says it 3 times. He ceased from all the work which he had done. Well, what did he do when he created the heavens and the earth? I would submit that what's the very next thing that we have? The account of the origins of mankind. we immediately begin the stories of human beings. God is the grand storyteller. And he's in the business. What he really wanted to do was tell stories. But before he could tell the stories, he was going to create the arena, the context in which those stories were going to take place. And what was that arena? What was that context? The heavens and the earth. Well, when God was done creating the heavens and the earth, he doesn't stop, he starts. When he has stopped creating the context and the arena, now he begins to get on with the real creative project, which he really had in mind before the foundation of the earth. He's going to tell this multifaceted complex of stories that center around human beings. And now the game begins. Now the game is afoot. I think that's what I think that's what he's trying to tell us. So God sanctified the seventh day and blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. What does he mean? It's not a day that he blessed. What he sanctified is the observance of the seventh day. Everywhere else in the account, when it talks about him blessing it, for example, God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish," and so on. What does it mean that he blessed them? That this activity of reproducing and filling the earth and multiplying is an activity that he is sanctioning. Yes, this is what I want you to do. So he's blessing it. So to bless the seventh day is to sanction and approve of Sabbath observance. That's the sense in which he blessed it and sanctified it. And so why did he sanction and approve of Sabbath observance? Because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Because the seventh day was when God had finished preparations and begun what life and reality was really all about. And there are several things that come together here, but I think what it amounts to is the seventh day is to be a memorial to the fact that my existence does not consist of my participation in the heavens and the earth. My existence is not about my physical body, for example, my material well-being, my survival, my flourishing biologically and materially. If all I was a part of the heavens and the earth that God created, then that would make sense. Go out and survive and flourish. Be fruitful and multiply, survive and flourish. Then that would make sense. But that's not why I was created. I wasn't created to survive and flourish. I was created to be a protagonist in a story. And what God is really doing in my existence is creating a story. The question is, what's going to be the nature of that story? Is it going to have a tragic ending? Am I going to go to my condemnation? Am I going to be a rebel against God that God comes against in judgment? Or am I going to be a creature who bows the knee and bows my heart to God in subjection to him, in recognition and acknowledgement of who he is and who I am in relationship to him? And I have that beautiful spirit of humility and contrition and everything that makes a righteous person a righteous person. Am I going to be good or am I going to be evil? What's going to be the flavor and complexion of the story that gets told through my life? Well, on the Sabbath day, I'm setting aside a day to reflect on, okay, my existence is not about the arena and the context. It's about what God really wanted to do, what God really wanted to accomplish And therefore, how am I going to live my life in the light of that being God's primary purpose? God wanted to create a person, not a body. What kind of person am I going to be? How am I going to invest myself in relationship to the fact that I know that God's purpose was to create me to be a person? Do I want to be a good one or an evil one? A rebellious one or a submissive one? A thankful one or an ingrate? What kind of person am I going to be? And what story is my life going to tell as I make my choices? I think the Sabbath day is a day to reflect on that reality, because God had completed the preparations on the seventh day and was beginning to start his real project, his main project. How am I going to relate to that main project, the primary purpose of God that he has for me? It's the first time I've been able to make sense out of the Sabbath. Rest, because God rested. But to reflect on the purpose of my existence, okay, I can see why you would set a day aside regularly to reflect on that. That makes all the sense in the world. Because what do we do the rest of the time? We survive and seek to flourish materially, physically. We want to take care of ourselves. We want to be comfortable. We want to have abundance and so on. But with what? With the stuff that got created on the first 6 days of creation. That stuff. But that's not why we're here. That's only the context in which our stories are going to get told. But that's not why we're here. To amass stuff and protect ourselves with stuff and survive on stuff. I can be a person who goes to my death and doesn't survive at all. I can be a person who doesn't prosper materially at all, but I can be a beautiful person in both cases. And that's really what God wants to do, is to make me a beautiful person. Wants me to become a beautiful person and tell a wonderful story through my overcoming the obstacles and so on and so forth. So now, can I answer your question, John? Remind me of your question. So why did he use this? Yeah. Yeah. So you can see why, if I'm right, the sense that it makes to put it here is he's making this a very important distinction between what creating the heavens and the earth did and accomplished, as over against what God really ultimately in the end wants to accomplish, which isn't done after 6 days. In fact, it hasn't even begun yet after the 6 days. And I think that's why it makes sense to convey the meaning and significance of the Sabbath day in the context of a creation account, because that's where it gets its meaning. Mm-hmm.
I am trying to process everything that you said and having my own thoughts too. So I'm not sure.
That's dangerous.
I know it's bad. It's bad. So I'm not sure if what I'm going to say is going to contradict things that you've said, the questions I'm going to ask, because I haven't quite processed all of that.
Okay.
But as I'm thinking about this, I'm wondering, the idea that's coming to my mind is that we have the author saying, okay, God finishes with this part, but there's still 1 day left, kind of thing. Like so he stops, and then part of God's creative work is then to say, set apart this day as different from the rest, as different from the others. Not to use the word rest because that's there, but that's not the way I'm meaning it. So there's these 6 days on which God is working, creating, building this arena as you're describing, and then the other day is different. He sets it apart for a specific purpose. And it makes sense to me that that purpose would be to cease from the kinds of things that you're describing, from the work, from the rat race, from all of that, to reflect on God as the creator, God's creative work, and as it seems to be suggesting that God did. Like he did it all, he stepped back, he saw it was good, and then there's a day that he kind of sets apart as memorializing that or marking the completion of that in a certain sense. So does that kind of fit with what you're saying?
It's not, it certainly it fits. It's not quite how I'm looking at it though, because remember, I've made a decision that the days are not duration. So God didn't rest for a period of time.
Sure.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Any more than it took him a period of time to create day and night and a period of time to do that. No, these are just category holders. And this category, day 1, holds this, and this category, day 2, holds this. Well, day 7 is another basket to hold a category. What it holds, if you will, is the context within which the narratives of human existence are going to occur is finished. It holds the category of the possibility of that part of God's project being done, being over, being completed, being finished. There isn't anything more to do on that. It's not that it takes a period of time, it's done. So in real time, when God had finished putting things in place, immediately the stories begin. I mean, really, basically with the creation of Adam, the stories begin. So it's not like there's some period of time where God has to rest first. It just begins.
Mm-hmm. I think I understand that distinction that you're making. The piece that's missing in my mind is it seems like the author is clearly connecting these 6 days and then the 7th day with the time that we experience of there being 6 days on which to work and a 7th day, literal day, on which to rest.
Well, that's why he uses 7 days, exactly, because in the Hebrew calendar, you have this period of time followed by this period of time 6 times, and you work on those, and then you have a period of time where you don't work there. So yeah, in the life of the Jewish people, those are very definitely periods of time, but they're not in the Genesis account, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But why did he pick those? Because to sanctify the 7th day and make it holy, that is for him to bless Sabbath observance, is I want you for a period of time to not survive and flourish, but to reflect on what your existence is really all about and remember what your existence is really all about.
Thanks.
Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. So it sounds like what you're saying is this is likely the authorial intent of Genesis 1. Mm-hmm. Is that fair? If that's true, do you have a sense at which point or why that intention deteriorated into kind of like a material, I should rest and get off my feet 1 day a week kind of principle? Any sense of that?
I don't. I don't. What is interesting is Sabbath observance predates the Mosaic Covenant. Because remember, when they're coming out of the Exodus, they come out of Egypt. Before they get to Mount Sinai, God feeds them with manna. And remember what happens in the feeding of the manna? On the Sabbath, don't collect on the Sabbath. God will provide. So you take double on the day before the Sabbath, and God will keep it from rotting during the Sabbath day. Well, you don't have any Jews going, Sabbath? What's a Sabbath? They seem to understand. It seems to be an instruction that makes sense to them. So apparently Sabbath observance predates the Mosaic Covenant. A lot of people misunderstand the language in the Mosaic Covenant because it'll say the Sabbath is given you as a sign, blah, 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 blah. And people mistake that for the meaning and significance of the Sabbath. But no, he's not saying that's the meaning and significance of the Sabbath. What he's saying is the fact that I am commanding you in this covenant to be Sabbath observers is a sign that I brought you out of Egypt and made you my people, and so on and so forth. What's a sign is the fact that it's part of the covenant, but that's not what Sabbath keeping means. Sabbath keeping already had meaning before we even get to the Exodus, I think.
So then when you flash forward to Hebrews,
Mhm.
and the author talks about the Sabbath rest,
Mhm.
I think this fits with the picture that you're painting, but I kind of have this picture that the Sabbath is also a metaphor for the work that we rest from once we're in the kingdom.
Right.
So that fits with.
Yeah, I think so, because, but again, it's not really rest from it. It's the work that we don't have to do any longer. We're done. We're
It's
complete.
the work
So-
of fighting sin.
Exactly.
Is how I've
It's
thought
over.
of it.
It's
And
because
I don't
sin
have
is
to fight
conquered.
that anymore. Yeah.
Exactly.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. I think it fits perfectly. Yeah.
Do you want to comment on the image?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, one thing I didn't comment on is how anthropomorphic this account is. This is very man-centered, human-centered. Again, in contrast to the mythology of the ancient world, which is very gods-centered. Why do men exist? To feed the gods, so they can kick back and have leisure and have human beings pop grapes in their mouth and stuff like that. I mean, that's why humans exist. Not in this account. Human beings, I think, are clearly the apex of God's creation. And I mean, even to the point of defining the sun and the moon as the things that are going to regulate our lives with respect to seasons and calendars and stuff like that. Animals don't regulate their lives by calendars and seasons and in the same way that human beings do. So everything in this account is very much from a man perspective, human perspective. And the most important of all that is no other being that God created is created in the image of God. Man is unique in that. We can talk more about that next week, because in the origin of mankind, we get that again. I think the image of God is what makes me in the image of God is that I am a person. Animals are never persons. We personify them, but that's my imagination. They're not created to be persons by God. They don't have the attributes of a person. And the only other being, well, I guess, I don't know. I've never met an angel. I don't know what angels are, but the only other being who is a person that I know of is God. So we reflect the personhood of God by being persons ourselves. Yes. Yes. I've just never met one. Yeah. Yeah. It's very rare, but 3 or 4 times in the Old Testament, it will refer to God in the plural with a plural pronoun and everything. And I don't make anything of that. I don't exactly know how to categorize it, but I think it's saying more about the Hebrew language than it is about God. It's a matter of what the plural means in the Hebrew language. Plural doesn't always mean plural in languages. Plural can be used for various kind of emphases or in a variety of different ways. It can have different actual meanings. And I think in this case, the plural doesn't mean plural, it means something else. But I can't analyze and pinpoint exactly what it means in this context. Sometimes people talk about the plural of majesty. that it's intended to reflect the majesty of God. That's plausible. That might be, but I'm just not sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was once on the radio with a guy who kept using the plural. We do this and we do that and we do the other and we do the other, and I thought what he meant by using the plural was just me and the other people at the school where I teach, that we think this and we do that. And the host of the program at one point said, "Would you like a glass of water?" And he said, "Yes, we would. Thank you." I thought, "Oh, okay."
Excuse me, Jack. Thanks, man. You're being thorough. A lot of thought-provoking stuff you've said so far. It's pretty cool. A lot of good insights, really. Did I miss something? Was that about the Trinity? Was that?
I don't know why he asked. It was just about the plural. Why? Yeah. Are you wanting to know about the Trinity?
Oh yeah. So I don't think we got there yet. But let us make man in our image.
Uh-huh.
I thought you were saying that right there. Let us make man in our image. Is that what you guys were talking about? Let us make
Mhm.
man in our image. That's not saying anything about God, is it?
Right.
So do you believe in the Trinity?
I
Father,
believe
Son,
in
Holy
the
Spirit.
Trinity the same way the Bible believes in the Trinity.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Which is pretty okay. What does that mean?
I believe that God, the Father, is God. I believe that Jesus, the Son, the Messiah, is God. I believe that the Spirit of God is the Spirit of God and is God.
Okay, cool.
So if that's believing in the Trinity, then I believe in the Trinity.
Yeah, that's all I meant. Yeah, cool. Thanks, man.